It was a typical hectic morning at the bustling headquarters of Apex Technologies. The glass doors of the sleek, modern building slid open as employees in sharp suits and polished shoes hurried in and out, their faces adorned with the confidence of a place where innovation thrived. The air buzzed with the sounds of phone calls, keyboard clacking, and the occasional burst of laughter from meeting rooms. Samuel Walker, an elderly man with graying hair and a weathered face, stood at the threshold of this modern marvel. Dressed in an old, worn jacket and scuffed shoes that had seen better days, he stood out in sharp contrast to the polished, youthful employees that filled the lobby. His cap was slightly askew, a sign of age and experience, and his posture, though bent, held a quiet dignity. He paused for a moment to take in his surroundings, the hum of activity and the gleam of technology around him. Despite the glaring difference in his appearance, Samuel felt a strange sense of purpose surge through him. He wasn't here by accident. This was the company he had heard so much about, the epitome of modern business, a place where success was built on ambition and intellect. He had come to ask for a job, a simple role that would allow him to support himself after the series of losses he had endured in the past few years. Approaching the front desk, Samuel waited patiently, his hands clasped together. A young receptionist, barely out of her 20s, looked up from her phone, her expression changing from neutral to surprised as she took in his appearance. Her eyes briefly scanned his old clothes before settling on his face. A faint, dismissive smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she spoke in a tone that bordered on condescending. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you with something?" Samuel nodded and spoke with humility, his voice calm but steady. "Yes, miss. I'm here to apply for a security guard position. Could you point me to the right person to speak with?" The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the request. She looked Samuel up and down, her eyes scanning his worn shoes, the fraying cuffs of his jacket, and his slightly crooked cap. She didn't hide her surprise, and her voice carried an undercurrent of disbelief as she answered. "Sir, I'm afraid this company has very high standards. I don't think you're what we're looking for." Samuel smiled politely, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't need much, miss. Just a simple job. I'm not asking for high pay, just something to keep me busy, something that's within my abilities." Her gaze faltered for a moment, but only for a brief second. With an almost dismissive wave of her hand, she said, "Security positions are for younger, stronger people. You might want to try somewhere else." Samuel's expression remained unchanged, his demeanor as composed as ever. Before he could respond, a voice from behind him interrupted. "Seriously?" a man said, his tone loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "You think you can guard this place? We hire young, strong people here, not, well, people like you." The voice came from a man who walked past the front desk, his body language oozing confidence. He was in his mid-30s, dressed in an impeccable suit, and his smile revealed an air of superiority. His name was Jake Matthews, and he worked as a project manager. He had always believed that success was about appearances, about showing the world that you had what it took, both in looks and in intellect. Jake's laughter was short and mocking. His words felt like a slap in the face, not just to Samuel, but to everyone in earshot. It was the kind of laughter that didn't come from humor, but from a place of arrogance. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, unsure whether to step in or let the moment pass. But Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Jake. He simply turned back to the receptionist and, in a voice that held no bitterness, asked, "Could I please speak with the hiring manager?" The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but nodded slowly. "I'll let you speak to him," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. As Samuel stood there waiting, the whispers of mocking employees filled the air around him. Their laughter echoed throughout the lobby, but he remained calm, unwavering. He wasn't here to argue or to prove anything to them. He had made his request, and now he would wait for it to be heard. All he needed was a chance, and if he couldn't get that, he would move on without complaint. But what he didn't know was that his request, his presence, would soon stir a chain of events that would change everything. The judgmental glances, the dismissive comments, and the laughter that followed were only the beginning. He had come here for a job. Yes, but what he would find at Apex Technologies was far more than what he had expected. The reactions of those who looked down on him would soon prove to be nothing more than the first lesson in a journey he had already set in motion. Samuel stood quietly, the noise of the office building seeming to grow louder around him. The hustle and bustle of young professionals rushing between meetings, the tapping of keyboards and the sound of phones ringing, it all seemed to swirl around him, as if he were invisible. But his patience never wavered. He had been through much worse than a few dismissive glances and harsh words. This was nothing compared to the battles he had fought in his life. As he waited, a few more employees walked by, their eyes lingering on him. They couldn't help but whisper to one another, exchanging bemused glances and muffled laughs. Some chuckled, others rolled their eyes, but no one stopped to offer him any real assistance. They just passed him by, pretending he wasn't there, pretending he didn't matter. The atmosphere in the lobby began to feel even colder. It was as though Samuel's presence was an uncomfortable anomaly in an otherwise polished world. A few moments later, the HR manager, Peter Graham, appeared in the doorway, wearing his typical crisp suit and a look of stern professionalism. Peter had a reputation for being sharp and efficient. He was in his early 30s, tall and slim, with a meticulously styled head of hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to measure everything and everyone around him. He had little patience for what he considered distractions, and Samuel's appearance clearly qualified as one. Peter glanced around the lobby, his eyes landing on Samuel with a barely hidden look of surprise. He approached with a brisk pace, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with every step. "Mr. Walker, I presume?" Peter asked, his voice cool and detached. Samuel nodded, raising his gaze to meet Peter's eyes. "Yes, I am. I was hoping to speak with you regarding the security guard position." Peter's lips curled into a faint smile, one that wasn't meant to reassure. "I see," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "I'm sure you've heard that our company maintains very high standards, Mr. Walker." His words were carefully measured, as though speaking slowly would somehow make the message clearer. "We don't typically hire people who don't fit the required profile." Samuel could sense the judgment in Peter's words, the subtle undercurrent of condescension. But he remained unfazed. His life had taught him to ignore the judgments of others, to focus on what truly mattered. In his calm, steady voice, Samuel replied, "I'm not asking for much. I just need work. Something simple. I have experience in various fields, and I'm more than capable of doing the job." Peter looked him up and down, his eyes narrowing as he seemed to weigh Samuel's words. "Experience?" Peter scoffed. "With all due respect, Mr. Walker, a company like ours needs people who are younger, faster, and, well, more suitable for the type of work we require. The position you're asking for is physically demanding, and you don't exactly look like someone who can handle it." Samuel's expression remained unshaken. "You'd be surprised what someone like me can do," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. Peter's lips pressed into a thin line. "If you think you can meet the standards we require, perhaps you should prove it." He motioned toward the door, as though dismissing him with a single wave of his hand. "I'm afraid this isn't the place for you, Mr. Walker. Good day." But before Peter could turn and walk away, Samuel spoke once more, his voice carrying the weight of years of life experience. "I've learned that the strongest men don't always look the part. Sometimes it's the ones you least expect who can surprise you." Peter paused for a moment, his back to Samuel, clearly irritated by the comment. But before he could respond, a loud voice from behind them interrupted the conversation. "Seriously," the voice said. It was Jake Matthews again. The same man who had mocked Samuel earlier. He appeared in the doorway of the HR office, wearing his usual air of superiority. "You're seriously going to let this old man apply for a job here?" Jake said, his voice carrying through the room as he approached with a smug grin on his face. "This is a professional environment. We don't need people slowing us down." The laughter in the room was immediate. It echoed throughout the lobby. A chorus of ridicule that seemed to magnify with each passing second. Jake's voice grew louder, almost gleeful in its cruelty. "Look at him," Jake continued. "Can you even imagine him working security here? He can barely walk without a cane. This is just pathetic." Samuel stood motionless, the mockery swirling around him. But unlike others, he didn't let the ridicule take root in his heart. He knew what they were doing. They thought they could break him with their words, but Samuel had faced far harsher trials in his life. This was nothing compared to the fire that had consumed everything he had worked for years ago, the losses that had scarred him deeply, the pain of seeing his family taken from him, the agony of rebuilding from the ground up. It was far greater than any humiliation these people could dish out. As the laughter grew louder, Samuel's calm demeanor never faltered. He didn't flinch. He didn't flounder. He simply stood there, waiting. Finally, he spoke. "If you don't mind," Samuel said quietly, "I'd like to speak with the hiring manager. Could you please show me the way?" Jake's expression faltered for a moment as he realized Samuel wasn't reacting the way he had expected. The mocking tone he had used suddenly felt out of place in the face of Samuel's quiet composure. But before he could say anything more, Peter interjected. "That's enough, Jake," Peter said sharply, clearly uncomfortable with the scene that was unfolding. "I'll handle this." With a dismissive wave, Peter gestured for Samuel to follow him, turning sharply on his heel as he led Samuel down a hallway. Jake and the other employees continued to snicker behind them, their voices fading as they walked deeper into the building. As they reached the door to Peter's office, Samuel paused for just a moment. He turned to Peter and spoke softly, almost as if he were sharing a piece of wisdom that had been passed down through generations. "One day," Samuel said, "you'll realize that judging a person by their appearance is the biggest mistake you can make." Peter didn't respond. Instead, he opened the door to his office, and Samuel stepped inside, ready to face whatever awaited him. What he didn't know was that this meeting, this seemingly insignificant moment, would set in motion a series of events that would unravel the very foundation of Apex Technologies. Days passed after Samuel's encounter in the lobby, and the sleek glass doors of Apex Technologies continued to open and close with the rhythm of daily business. The atmosphere was as fast-paced as ever. Employees were absorbed in their work, building the future of technology and innovation, their lives seemingly marked by nothing more than deadlines and meetings. But one event, though small in the grand scheme of things, would soon alter the course of the company's future. It all began with a black luxury car, a sleek, high-end vehicle that glided to a stop in front of the building, drawing the curious eyes of every employee in the vicinity. The kind of car that didn't simply arrive, it announced itself. With tinted windows and a VIP license plate that shimmered with the unmistakable mark of high status, it was a sight that turned heads. People stopped mid-step to stare, their gazes shifting between the car and each other in quiet awe. The vehicle's engine sputtered to a stop, and the door opened with a soft whoosh. A man stepped out, tall, with broad shoulders and a presence that commanded attention. His face was sharp, angular, with piercing eyes that seemed to cut straight through the surrounding noise. The man was well-dressed, wearing a tailored dark suit that clung to his frame with the precision of someone who had both wealth and taste. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the pavement as he stood outside the vehicle, scanning the building with a look of quiet authority. His name was Richard Lawson, and despite his calm demeanor, he was not a man who could be ignored. The murmurs of the employees grew louder as the man walked toward the entrance, his assistant following closely behind. Samuel's unexpected presence at the company had triggered a series of events. But now, it seemed, someone far more influential had arrived. Richard wasn't just a regular visitor. He was the CEO of a successful chain of companies, a man with power that reached into the highest circles of business and beyond. Inside the building, the whispers that had started with Samuel's visit only intensified with the arrival of Richard. Employees exchanged curious glances and half-hearted speculations. Who was he? What did he want? Was he here for a meeting, or was there something more to this unexpected visit? As Richard walked into the building, his assistant quickly stepped forward and approached the receptionist, speaking in hushed tones. The receptionist, clearly flustered, immediately scrambled to make a call. The HR department had to be informed. Richard was not the kind of person who simply showed up without a reason, and his presence demanded respect. Minutes passed, and the news spread quickly to the HR office. Peter Graham, still recovering from his earlier interaction with Samuel, straightened up in his chair as he saw Richard approach his office. He quickly adjusted his tie, wiped the sweat from his palms, and tried to regain his composure. Richard wasn't just any visitor. He was a businessman whose name had earned a reputation in the world of corporate mergers and acquisitions. Peter knew he had to be on his best behavior. "Mr. Lawson," Peter said, extending his hand with an air of calculated politeness. "It's an honor to have you here. How can I assist you today?" Richard didn't take Peter's hand right away. Instead, he glanced briefly at the receptionist, who had returned to her station with a slightly panicked expression, and then back at Peter. His gaze was unwavering, and the sharpness of his stare seemed to peel away the layers of formality Peter had carefully constructed. "I need to speak with you," Richard said, his voice cool and steady, "about a recent incident here involving an elderly man who came to apply for a security position. His name was Samuel Walker." Peter's heart skipped a beat. The moment Samuel had entered his life, he hadn't imagined that his actions would lead to something so far-reaching. "Mr. Walker, sir?" Peter repeated, feigning ignorance, though his discomfort was palpable. "I recall an interview, but he was not deemed suitable for the role." Richard's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Not suitable?" he repeated, as though savoring the word. "What do you mean by that?" Peter hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't meet the physical requirements, Mr. Lawson. He was too old, too frail for the position," Peter explained, though he felt his voice falter under Richard's unwavering gaze. Richard let the silence hang between them for a moment before speaking again, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. "Do you understand who Samuel Walker is?" he asked, his tone carrying a sharp edge. "He's not just some elderly man looking for a job. He is someone I deeply respect. Without him, none of us would be where we are today." Peter's face turned pale as the weight of Richard's words settled in. He had heard the name before, but it had never crossed his mind that Samuel Walker could be someone of such importance. Samuel, with his worn jacket and humble demeanor, how could this man possibly be anything more than what Peter had dismissed him to be? Richard's eyes held steady as he continued. Samuel Walker was the founder of a company that revolutionized the woodworking industry. His craftsmanship was unparalleled, and his leadership made his employees feel valued, supported, and appreciated. If not for him, I wouldn't be in the position I am today. He mentored me, Peter. I owe my success to him. Peter's stomach sank as the full weight of his earlier actions hit him like a ton of bricks. He had dismissed a man who had changed the course of Richard's life, a man who had built not only a successful business, but had cultivated the very values of integrity and respect that Richard had carried with him into his own career. Now Peter realized he had made a grave mistake, a mistake that could cost him far more than a mere job. Turning to his assistant, Richard's voice was firm, yet controlled. "Find Samuel Walker. I want to meet him before the day is out. Make it happen." Within hours, the search for Samuel was underway. Richard's assistant worked tirelessly, tracking down any leads that could point to Samuel's whereabouts. It didn't take long before they located his address, a modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far from the towering skyscrapers of the corporate world. Richard, determined to make things right, insisted on visiting Samuel in person. He knew this was a man who had earned more than just a quick apology. He deserved respect, and Richard intended to give it to him. "Prepare for an apology," he instructed his assistant. "And make sure everyone knows that today we'll learn the true value of a person, and how judging someone based on appearances is the worst mistake we can make." With that, Richard climbed into his car, his assistant by his side, and they set off toward the small house where Samuel lived, unaware that this journey would lead to a reunion that would shake the very foundation of Apex Technologies and teach its employees a lesson they would never forget. Richard and his assistant drove in silence, the hum of the luxury car's engine the only sound breaking through the tension that seemed to envelop them. Richard's mind raced, replaying the details of his conversation with Peter, his realization of just how little he had understood about Samuel Walker, the man who had once been his mentor and had helped him when no one else would. How could he have missed the significance of that fateful meeting? As they neared the outskirts of the city, the towering buildings and concrete roads gave way to quiet suburban streets lined with modest homes. The contrast was stark. Samuel's life, it seemed, had been a quiet one after his disappearance from the business world. Richard, however, couldn't help but wonder how much this man had really left behind. If anything, he had left a legacy far greater than the walls of Apex Technologies or any other corporation could contain. The car slowed as they turned onto a narrow street, finally coming to a stop in front of a small but well-kept house. The garden in front, although humble, was cared for. Flowers bloomed in neat rows, and the lawn was trimmed with a precision that suggested someone with deep care for their surroundings still resided here. Richard could see the warmth and simplicity of this life reflected in the surroundings. Samuel Walker didn't live the life of a forgotten man. He had lived on his own terms, his wealth and legacy built not from material riches, but from the bonds he had fostered with the people around him. As Richard stepped out of the car, he caught sight of the small house's front door, which opened before he had the chance to knock. Standing in the doorway was Samuel, his aged face soft, but with a warmth in his eyes that contrasted the strength in his posture. His clothes were simple, yet they were worn with the dignity of someone who had never been concerned with appearances. "Richard," Samuel said, his voice quiet but warm, as though he had been expecting him. "I knew you'd come." Richard, momentarily struck by the ease with which Samuel recognized him, found himself at a loss for words. How many years had passed since they had last spoken? The man standing before him was not the same one he had known, the businessman who had taken his young protege under his wing. He was older, yes, but his presence was just as commanding as ever. "Mr. Walker," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that was hard to mask. "I owe you an apology. What happened at Apex Technologies, what I allowed to happen, was inexcusable. I've spent so long in a world that measures people by their success, their wealth, their position, that I lost sight of what really matters. And you," Richard paused as if the words caught in his throat, "you were the one who taught me that." Samuel smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that held no trace of bitterness. "I knew what you'd become. You always had it in you, Richard. You had a fire in you, but you needed direction. You needed someone to guide you." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. The weight of Samuel's words hit him deeply. All those years of mentorship, of teaching him not just about business but about life, were never truly appreciated until now. "You gave me a chance when no one else would," Richard continued, his voice growing more earnest. "I lost sight of that. And when I saw you at Apex, when I dismissed you as someone who couldn't possibly fit the role of a security guard, I betrayed everything you had ever taught me." Samuel's gaze softened. "You didn't betray me, Richard. You were lost in your world of suits and power, just like I once was. But I've seen you grow, seen you take the lessons I shared with you and build something remarkable. You didn't lose sight of who you are. You just got caught up in the wrong things for a moment." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he had been holding onto for so many years. "I've made mistakes, big ones, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Samuel stepped forward, his hand outstretched, offering Richard something far more valuable than any apology. He offered understanding. "You don't need to apologize to me," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You needed to see for yourself, and now you have. It's not about me. It's about what you've learned and what you do with it moving forward." Richard nodded, his eyes now locked with Samuel's. "So what happens now? What do I do to make things right?" Samuel gave a small, knowing chuckle. "Making things right, Richard, isn't as simple as making an apology or handing out a position. It's about changing the way you think, the way you lead. You've learned something powerful today, something about yourself and about the people you surround yourself with. Don't forget that." For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had been so busy climbing the corporate ladder, so eager to prove himself to others, that he had forgotten the true value of integrity, humility, and respect. Now, standing here with the man who had helped shape his life, he understood what it meant to lead with heart, not just with ambition. "You're right," Richard said softly, "and I will never forget this lesson. Thank you." The two men stood there in silence for a moment, both understanding that this was not just a simple meeting, it was a turning point, a moment that would define their futures. And as they exchanged one final, meaningful look, Samuel's hand dropped to his side, and he spoke again, this time with a quiet certainty. "You've come a long way, Richard, but your journey doesn't end here. The road ahead is long, but I have no doubt you'll make the right choices from now on." With that, Richard turned to leave, but not before giving Samuel one last respectful nod. "I'll make sure Apex knows the truth," he said. "I'll make sure everyone knows what you really did for me, and for all of us." Samuel gave him a final nod of approval. "Do what you must, Richard, but remember, true change comes from within. Let that be the first step." As Richard got back into the car, he knew that this visit, this moment of reconciliation, was not just about setting the record straight. It was about honoring the lessons Samuel had imparted to him. He didn't need a title to define his worth. The lesson was clear now. Integrity, humility, and respect were the true measures of success. And as the car sped back toward the city, Richard felt something inside him shift. The walls of Apex Technologies, with their polished glass and steel, no longer seemed as important. It was the people, the ones who cared, the ones who truly understood, that mattered. And as he prepared for what lay ahead, he knew that he had a duty to lead with the kind of wisdom Samuel had shown him all those years ago. The next morning at Apex Technologies, a subtle tension filled the air. Employees arrived at their desks, but there was an unmistakable buzz of uncertainty. News of the meeting between Richard and Samuel Walker had spread through the office like wildfire, and everyone was wondering what would happen next. Richard had always been a figure of power and prestige, but now, with Samuel Walker's name being mentioned in such a respectful light, it seemed as if the very foundation of the company had shifted. Inside the sleek, glass-walled boardroom, Richard sat at the head of the table, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet resolve. He looked down at the polished surface of the table, lost in thought. The company he had built, the empire of Apex Technologies that was now a global force, seemed suddenly small in comparison to the lesson he had learned over the past few days. It wasn't just the business he had inherited, it was the relationships, the human connections, that truly mattered, and Samuel Walker had reminded him of that. The door swung open, and Mark, Richard's assistant, entered with an air of urgency. "Mr. Lawson, we've arranged for Samuel Walker to arrive in a few moments," Mark said, glancing around the room nervously. "But the staff, they're not sure how to react. Some of them feel guilty, others are just confused. I don't think they understand what this meeting is about yet." Richard nodded solemnly, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "Let them feel whatever they need to feel. But today, they'll learn something important about respect, humility, and true leadership." Mark paused, then spoke with hesitation. "Are you sure about this? Bringing Mr. Walker into the company like this? He's not like us, Richard. He doesn't fit the mold." Richard's eyes met Mark's, and for the first time, there was a hint of vulnerability in his gaze. "No one should fit a mold, Mark. Not anymore. That's the problem we've all fallen into. We've spent too long in a world of appearances, of power plays and titles. It's time we learn to value people for who they truly are, not for how they're packaged." Mark said nothing more, but his eyes seemed to register a shift in Richard's demeanor. As the minutes ticked by, the staff slowly gathered in the lobby, unsure of what to expect. And then, the moment arrived. The door to the boardroom opened once more, and in walked Samuel Walker, looking every bit as calm and dignified as he had the day before. But this time, he wasn't standing in the doorway of a humble house. He was walking into the heart of a company that had once dismissed him. And this time, he wasn't just a visitor. He was a man of undeniable importance. As Samuel walked into the room, the employees froze. There were no whispers, there's no murmurs of confusion, only stunned silence. Samuel's presence was a force unto itself. He wasn't dressed in the same humble clothes he had worn before. Instead, he wore a simple but well-tailored suit, his attire a quiet testament to his sense of dignity. His gray hair was neatly combed, his eyes sharp and clear despite his years. He looked like someone who had lived a life full of purpose, someone who had witnessed the world's ups and downs and had emerged with something far greater than riches: wisdom. Richard stood and motioned for Samuel to take a seat at the head of the table. As Samuel sat down, the staff awkwardly shuffled into their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. No one knew how to begin. Richard took the lead, his voice steady, but filled with purpose. Everyone, I want you to meet Samuel Walker. For those of you who don't know him, he is one of the founding figures of this company, and I owe him everything. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the silence was thick with disbelief. Richard's admission had caught everyone off guard. The employees exchanged surprised looks, some mouths hanging open in shock. Yes, Richard continued, his voice firm. Samuel Walker is not just a businessman. He's a mentor, a leader who taught me everything I know. He's the one who shaped the man I am today, and without him, none of us would be here. A few employees, who had previously mocked Samuel when he had come to the company for the security guard position, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. But the weight of Richard's words began to settle in. Samuel had been more than just an old man with a humble request. He had been a guiding force in shaping the very company they worked for, even if they hadn't realized it. Samuel, ever the calm presence, didn't speak immediately. Instead, he surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the people who had once looked down on him. He understood their surprise, their confusion. After all, the world they lived in was built on appearances, and he had never fit into that world. But that, he knew, was the very point. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to command attention from even the most skeptical in the room. I didn't come here today to remind you of your mistakes. I came because you all have something precious to learn. You've built a company, a reputation, on the foundation of success, but it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters. You've spent years building a world where titles and wealth define you. But I'll tell you this, the true measure of a person is never in their title or their paycheck. It's in their character, their integrity, their ability to see beyond the surface. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. Everyone sat still, listening intently. Each of you, Samuel continued, has the potential to do great things. But that potential is nothing without humility and respect for others. Today, I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to show you that success without compassion is hollow. And I believe that if you want to build something that will last, you must first build it on a foundation of trust, kindness, and understanding. Richard looked at Samuel, pride and admiration shining in his eyes. He had always respected Samuel's wisdom, but hearing it now in this setting made it even more profound. Samuel turned to face the staff again, his eyes now soft but firm. Remember, the way you treat others speaks volumes about who you are, and it is never too late to change. Never forget that. The room was silent as the staff absorbed Samuel's words. No one spoke, but in that moment, something inside each of them shifted. Samuel's presence had reminded them of the things they had long forgotten, the values that had been buried beneath ambition, competition, and the drive for success. Richard stood up once more and addressed the room. I want you all to understand something. Samuel Walker is the reason I'm standing here today, and I hope that, just as he changed my life, he can help guide you as well. Let's learn from this moment and make this company something that reflects not just success, but true character. With that, Richard turned to Samuel, offering him a respectful nod. Samuel returned the gesture, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. And with that, the future of Apex Technologies began to change, as the staff, once so focused on outward success, now began to understand the true value of integrity and character. They had been given a second chance, a new way of seeing the world, through the eyes of a man who had lived through the highs and lows, but had never lost sight of what truly mattered. As Samuel sat quietly in the boardroom, reflecting on his words and the gravity of the moment, the room seemed to pulse with a new energy. The employees who had once viewed him with disdain now sat in respectful silence, contemplating the significance of what they had just heard. Richard Lawson, standing beside Samuel, was filled with a sense of pride, but also a newfound sense of responsibility. He had always been a man of ambition, but today, for the first time, he understood that true success was not defined by profits or power. It was about making a difference in the lives of others. Samuel Walker, the man who had once been an ordinary entrepreneur with big dreams, had now become a symbol of something much greater. And his story, the one that had led him to this very moment, was one of profound resilience and quiet strength, a story that would soon be unveiled to those who had been blinded by their own perceptions. Years ago, Samuel had been a name known to a select few, an innovative entrepreneur who had built a respected small business from the ground up. His company, Walker Enterprises, had been renowned for its handcrafted goods, producing fine furniture and bespoke designs that were sought after by discerning customers. But Samuel was not only known for his skill as a craftsman. He was admired for his unwavering integrity and for the way he treated his employees, not just as workers, but as partners in success. Under his leadership, the company had flourished, and Samuel had made a name for himself as a businessman with a conscience, always putting the well-being of his staff ahead of short-term gains. Samuel had never been one to flaunt his wealth or his accomplishments. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight, quietly building his business with humility. He was a man who believed in the power of hard work, the importance of kindness, and the idea that wealth should be shared, not hoarded. His employees adored him, not because of his wealth, but because he made them feel valued. He knew their names, their families, and their dreams. He invested in their growth, offering scholarships, training programs, and career advancement opportunities. He was a mentor to many, including Richard Lawson, who had once been a young, ambitious apprentice at Walker Enterprises. Samuel had taken him under his wing, teaching him not just the technical skills required for the job, but the ethical principles that would shape him into the man he was today. But as often happens in life, tragedy struck when a catastrophic fire consumed Samuel's factory. The blaze, which started in the warehouse late one evening, destroyed everything Samuel had worked so hard to build: his home, his business, and his dreams, gone in the blink of an eye. But the true tragedy lay in the fact that the fire also claimed the lives of his wife, Elizabeth, and their only son, Thomas. The loss was devastating. Samuel, unable to bear the weight of the grief, withdrew from the world, selling off the remnants of his business to pay off debts and retreating into obscurity. The man who had once been at the forefront of innovation and success was now a shadow of his former self. He moved to a small, quiet neighborhood, far from the bustling city that had once been his playground. His days were filled with silence, and his nights with memories of what could have been. Samuel never spoke about the fire, nor did he seek pity. He simply chose to live quietly, far away from the world that had once revered him. And yet, even in his retreat, he remained the man who had shaped so many lives, even if they no longer remembered him. The world moved on without him. Apex Technologies, a rising tech giant, took the lead in the industry, growing exponentially under Richard Lawson's direction. But as Richard rose to prominence, something inside him began to shift. He had become a successful businessman, yes, but at what cost? In his pursuit of power and wealth, had he lost sight of the values Samuel had taught him all those years ago? Richard had built Apex Technologies with his intelligence, charisma, and a drive that was unmatched. But the more he succeeded, the more he began to realize that something was missing. The company he had built, while profitable, lacked the warmth, the human connection that Samuel's business had once embodied. The lessons Samuel had imparted were now just distant memories, buried under layers of corporate culture and bottom lines. Richard knew something needed to change, but he didn't know what until Samuel had re-entered his life. When Samuel had come to Apex Technologies, seeking only a humble position as a security guard, Richard had felt the spark of something he had long forgotten. The old man, with his weathered face and quiet dignity, had reminded Richard of the man he had once been. A man who understood that success was about more than just profits. It was about the people you worked with, the integrity you upheld, and the legacy you left behind. Samuel had come to remind Richard of the core values he had once held dear and that he had lost along the way. Now, standing beside Samuel in the boardroom, Richard realized the depth of the lessons he had learned. He understood, more than ever, that the true measure of success was not found in stock prices or market share, but in the relationships you built, the people you mentored, and the impact you had on the lives of others. Samuel's return was not just a reunion, it was a rebirth for Apex Technologies, a chance to rebuild the company on the values that had once made it strong. Richard turned to Samuel, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've learned so much from you, Samuel, not just about business, but about life. You've taught me that true success is not about how much money you make, but about how you treat people. And I want this company to reflect that." Samuel nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've always had the potential, Richard. You just needed to remember what really matters. Now, it's your turn to teach the next generation." And so, in that moment, a new chapter began for both Richard and Samuel. The lessons of the past, the wisdom of a man who had once been forgotten, would now shape the future of Apex Technologies. Richard would ensure that the company would not just be known for its profits, but for its integrity, respect, and commitment to making the world a better place. And Samuel, though no longer a businessman in the traditional sense, would continue to guide and mentor, ensuring that the values he had once instilled would never be forgotten. The employees of Apex Technologies, once dismissive and blind to the lessons of humility, now found themselves at the beginning of a profound transformation. They had seen the power of integrity, the strength of character, and the importance of valuing people beyond their titles. And in that moment, they understood that success was not measured by what you had, but by who you were, and the difference you made in the lives of others. The company, under Richard's new leadership and Samuel's guidance, would rise to even greater heights, not because of the products it sold, but because of the people it embraced, the values it upheld, and the legacy it would leave behind. And for Samuel Walker, the humble craftsman who had once been dismissed, this was his true legacy, a legacy of kindness, respect, and the reminder that it is never too late to change the world. The transformation within Apex Technologies was profound, but the real journey had only just begun. As Samuel and Richard worked together to reshape the company's culture, the employees were beginning to experience a new kind of leadership, one that was centered around respect, collaboration, and the understanding that a company is more than just the sum of its products. It is the people within it, their values, and their integrity that define its true success. The company's upward trajectory was evident in its rising profits, but what was more apparent was the shift in the corporate atmosphere. There was a newfound sense of purpose, a belief that work was not just about the daily grind, but about making a difference, both within the company and in the world. The most significant change, however, wasn't just within the walls of Apex Technologies. It was in the ripple effect that Samuel's story had created outside the company. The man who had once been seen as a relic of the past, a forgotten entrepreneur who had fallen into obscurity, was now a symbol of resilience, wisdom, and a true leader. He became the subject of many conversations, not just within the walls of Apex, but in the wider business community. His story was one of redemption, of quiet humility in the face of devastating loss, and the realization that true worth is not determined by appearances or age, but by one's character and the legacy they leave behind. Richard, who had once seen Samuel as an old man with little to offer, now turned to him for advice on matters both personal and professional. Their relationship had evolved beyond that of mentor and mentee. They were now partners, working together to build a future they both believed in. Samuel, in turn, had found a sense of purpose he had not known in years. After the loss of his family and the destruction of his business, he had felt like an empty vessel, drifting through life with no clear direction. But now, surrounded by those who respected him, he realized that his work was far from over. The lessons he had learned in his younger days, the wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime, were more valuable than ever. And now, he had the opportunity to pass those lessons on to the next generation of leaders. But it wasn't just the employees at Apex Technologies who were learning from Samuel's example. In the months that followed, Samuel began to receive letters and messages from people all over the world. Former colleagues, old friends, and even strangers who had heard of his story. Many of them had been inspired by his ability to rebuild not just his business, but his entire life. Some had been struggling with their own setbacks, and Samuel's story gave them the hope and courage to keep going. Others simply wanted to express their admiration for the man who had turned his life around, even when it seemed that all hope was lost. Among those who reached out was an old friend of Samuel's from his earlier years, Clara Evans. Clara had been a fellow entrepreneur, a woman who had built a successful marketing firm from the ground up. She and Samuel had met at a business conference years ago, and their friendship had been forged over shared values and mutual respect. They had lost touch after Samuel's fire, but Clara had never forgotten him. When she heard of his return to the business world, she knew she had to reach out. Clara's message was simple but heartfelt. Samuel, I heard about your journey and the incredible impact you've had at Apex Technologies. I'm so proud of you. If you ever need anything, whether it's business advice or just a friend to talk to, please don't hesitate to reach out. I've always admired your strength and your ability to overcome even the greatest obstacles. The message was a reminder to Samuel that his impact wasn't just confined to the walls of Apex. He had touched lives, built relationships, and left a legacy that transcended business success. And it wasn't just his employees or his mentees who had learned from him. His peers and friends were also inspired by his perseverance, his integrity, and his unwavering belief in the power of human connection. As Samuel read Clara's message, he realized that he had underestimated the extent of his influence. He had been so focused on rebuilding his life that he hadn't fully understood the ripple effect his actions had created. He had assumed that his story was a personal one, a journey of individual redemption. But in truth, it had become a story that had inspired countless others to take stock of their own lives, to reflect on what truly mattered, and to make changes for the better. Clara's message was a turning point for Samuel. It reminded him that his work at Apex was not just about restoring his own sense of purpose. It was about helping others rediscover theirs as well. He realized that he could not stop here. His journey had come full circle, but there were still many people who could benefit from his experiences, his wisdom, and his guidance. Samuel knew that he had to continue to reach out, to share his story, and to offer a helping hand to those who needed it most. In the weeks that followed, Samuel and Richard worked together to establish a mentorship program at Apex Technologies, modeled after the principles Samuel had instilled in his own company years ago. The program was designed to help young employees develop not only their professional skills, but also their personal growth. Samuel took on the role of a mentor, guiding the next generation of leaders with the same care and attention he had given to Richard when he was starting out. The program was a resounding success, and it wasn't long before other companies began to take notice of what was happening at Apex. Samuel's story was now being shared at business conferences, in boardrooms, and in classrooms around the world. He had become a beacon of hope for those who had experienced loss or failure. That's a reminder that success was not defined by wealth or status, but by one's ability to persevere, to stay true to one's values, and to make a positive impact on the lives of others. One day, as Samuel was walking through the halls of Apex Technologies, he was stopped by a young employee named Emma. She had been a part of the mentorship program and had grown close to Samuel over the months they had worked together. She had always admired his humility and his wisdom, but now, standing before him, she realized that the impact he had on her life was far greater than she could ever express. "Mr. Walker," Emma said, her voice filled with gratitude, "I just wanted to thank you. Your guidance has meant more to me than you can imagine. I used to think that success was all about climbing the corporate ladder, but you've shown me that there's so much more to it. You've taught me that leadership is about kindness, integrity, and lifting others up. I'll carry those lessons with me for the rest of my life." Samuel smiled at her words, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "You're very welcome, Emma. But remember, it's not me you should thank. It's the values you've already started to embody that will take you far. You've got the strength within you to lead with heart, just as I know Richard and I are doing now. Don't ever forget that." As Emma walked away, Samuel felt a wave of contentment wash over him. He had come full circle. From the man who had been rejected and dismissed to the mentor who was now shaping the future of a new generation of leaders, he had found his true calling. His journey had not only healed him, it had allowed him to heal others as well. And so, Samuel Walker's legacy continued to grow, not through the business empire he had built, but through the lives he had touched, the hearts he had changed, and the principles he had passed on to those who would carry them forward long after he was gone. The crisp morning air carried with it the weight of something significant, something long awaited. It was a day that had been building for years, since the moment Samuel Walker had walked away from everything he had once known. The car parked outside Apex Technologies was sleek and polished, its black exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Inside, the office buzzed with the usual hum of activity, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation in the air. Today, something monumental was about to unfold. Samuel, now a seasoned man with a lifetime of wisdom etched into his weathered face, stepped out of the luxury vehicle with the confidence of someone who had walked through fire and emerged unscathed. He was dressed sharply, his dark suit a perfect reflection of his renewed sense of purpose. As he moved towards the entrance, the employees who had once mocked him, dismissed him as nothing more than a relic of the past, paused in their tracks. Their gazes were glued to him, a mixture of disbelief and awe playing across their faces. These were the same individuals who had once laughed at his humble request for a security guard position, the same ones who had looked at him with disdain, assuming he had nothing of value to offer. But now, standing before them, was the man who had not only rebuilt his life, but had also reshaped the very foundation of the company they worked for. Inside the building, James, the HR manager who had once been the most vocal in his ridicule, stood frozen. His mind raced as he watched Samuel approach the elevator, flanked by Richard, his former mentee. James's pale face betrayed his confusion and discomfort. He knew that this was a turning point, a moment that would forever alter the way he saw the world, and, most painfully, the way he saw himself. As Samuel entered the elevator, the employees gathered in hushed silence. They had no idea who the man walking through their halls truly was, what he had accomplished, or the legacy he carried with him. All they knew was that they had misjudged him, gravely. Samuel's presence, dignified and calm, spoke volumes about the path he had taken, the hardships he had endured, and the man he had become. Upstairs, the senior executives waited in the boardroom, unaware of the momentous arrival that was about to take place. Richard had called for a meeting, but this was no ordinary gathering. It was a chance for the company's leaders to witness something that would forever change their understanding of success, power, and leadership. As the elevator doors opened, Samuel stepped out into the gleaming glass and steel corridor, his steps slow but purposeful. Richard was beside him, but this time, the roles had reversed. Richard had always been the ambitious young man striving for success, while Samuel had once been the teacher, the mentor. But now, Samuel's quiet strength had become the guiding light for all of them. They walked together down the corridor, and with each step, the employees who had once doubted him watched in stunned silence. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the world had momentarily paused, allowing Samuel to take the stage. His footsteps echoed through the hall, reverberating with the weight of his experience, his knowledge, and the truth of his journey. When they reached the boardroom, Richard opened the door, and Samuel entered, his presence commanding attention. The room fell silent. The executives, who had once been so confident in their decisions, now found themselves unsure, uneasy. They looked at Samuel as if they were seeing him for the first time, and in many ways, they were. Richard stood beside Samuel, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the room. "Today," Richard began, "I have the honor of introducing someone who is not just a mentor to me, but a man who is at the heart of everything that has made this company what it is today. The man who inspired not just me, but all of us, to reach for more than just profits. Samuel Walker, the man whose vision and leadership built this company from the ground up." A ripple of gasps passed through the room. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The quiet, unassuming figure they had all dismissed was none other than the founder of the company, Samuel Walker, the very man whose legacy they had built their careers upon. The executives exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of disbelief and shame. They had no idea that the person they had so callously ignored was, in fact, the soul of Apex Technologies. They had all made their assumptions based on outward appearances, on the fleeting judgments of a few moments. They had failed to see the depth of the man before them. Samuel stood still, his gaze unwavering as he addressed the room with a calmness that commanded respect. I've spent many years in the shadows, Samuel began, his voice steady but firm, building something that I believed in, something that could last long after I was gone. I've watched this company grow, and I've seen it thrive. But along the way, I've also seen how easy it is to forget the very principles that made it successful in the first place. He paused, his eyes scanning the room of executives. You all have the potential to lead with integrity, to make decisions that reflect the values this company was built on. But I wonder, how many of you truly understand what it means to lead with humility, with respect, and with a heart that puts others before your own success? There was a long silence. No one spoke. The weight of Samuel's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Richard, standing beside Samuel, added with conviction, "What Samuel has shown us, through his actions and his life, is that true leadership is not about titles, power, or wealth. It's about the impact you have on the people around you, the way you treat those who have no voice, and the legacy you leave behind." As Samuel finished speaking, he turned to James, the HR manager, who stood at the back of the room, his face flushed with guilt. Samuel's gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the depth of his words. "James," Samuel said quietly, "do you remember the day you turned me away? When you laughed at my request to work as a security guard? You saw only a man in worn clothes and assumed I had nothing to offer. But today, I hope you understand that appearances can be deceiving. It's not the clothes we wear or the positions we hold that define us. It's the choices we make, the values we uphold, and the way we treat others that shape our true worth." James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The room was silent again, as everyone processed the truth of what Samuel had just said. Samuel turned back to the executives. "It is my hope that from this day forward, we will all remember the true meaning of leadership. Let's work together, not just for the company's success, but for the success of the people who make it possible, our employees, our clients, and our communities." With that, Samuel Walker, once seen as an outsider, a relic of the past, had returned, not to claim power, but to remind them of the very principles that had made Apex Technologies great in the first place. And in doing so, he had redefined leadership for an entire generation. As the meeting came to an end, the executives stood in stunned silence, their minds racing, their hearts heavy with the realization that they had been given a second chance to make things right, to build something that was truly worthy of the legacy Samuel Walker had left behind. And for Samuel, the journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. The atmosphere in the boardroom was thick with tension, each executive trying to come to terms with what had just transpired. Samuel Walker, the man they had once dismissed, now stood before them not only as a founder, but as a living testament to the values they had all forgotten in their pursuit of power and profit. His words, sharp and clear, had cut through their carefully constructed facades, and now they were left to face the raw truth of their actions. Richard, standing beside Samuel, surveyed the room with a quiet authority. He knew that Samuel's return was more than just a moment of reckoning for the executives. It was a pivotal moment for the entire company. The executives, though humbled, were still in the process of absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Samuel's gaze lingered on James, the HR manager, whose face had turned a deep shade of crimson. James had been the most vocal in dismissing him, and now, standing at the center of this moment, he could not hide the guilt that weighed heavily on his shoulders. Samuel had shown them all that success wasn't measured by wealth or position, but by the integrity with which one lived and led. "James," Samuel said, his voice low but commanding, "I know you've made mistakes, just as we all have, but it's how we handle those mistakes, how we rise from them, that truly matters." James, his eyes downcast, nodded slowly. He was ashamed, but there was a flicker of something else behind his eyes. A realization. He had seen the truth in Samuel's words, and now he was forced to confront the kind of leader he had become, one who valued appearances and status above all else. It was a humbling lesson, one that would shape the rest of his career. "I understand," James finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I will do everything I can to make it right. I've learned today that leadership isn't about power, it's about people." Samuel gave him a small nod, acknowledging the sincerity in his apology. "Good," he said. We all have a long way to go, but we can only move forward if we choose to learn from our mistakes and grow. The room was quiet again, but this time it was different. There was no discomfort, no tension. Instead, there was a sense of hope, of new beginnings. The employees who had once mocked Samuel now watched him with respect, understanding that they had been wrong about him, about what mattered in life. Samuel had come to teach them not just about leadership, but about life itself. Turning to face the executives once more, Samuel addressed them all in a steady, calm voice. Leadership is about much more than making decisions that affect the bottom line, he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. It's about making decisions that affect the people we lead, their lives, their families, their futures. The true measure of success is not how much we accumulate for ourselves, but how much we give to others, how much we invest in their growth, in their well-being. The executives listened intently, each one hearing the depth of Samuel's words, feeling the weight of their own failures and missteps. For so long, they had focused on their own ambitions, blinded by the pursuit of wealth and power. They had forgotten the most important lesson of all, that true wealth comes from the relationships we build, the trust we foster, and the integrity we uphold. Richard, who had once been mentored by Samuel, now found himself in the position of guiding the very people who had once looked down on him. It was a strange, almost poetic shift. But he knew that with Samuel's wisdom, they could rebuild the company from the inside out, focusing not on profit margins, but on the people who made Apex Technologies what it was. As the meeting came to a close, Samuel stood up from his chair, his posture straight and dignified. He knew that this moment was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. It wasn't just about reshaping a company. It was about reshaping the hearts and minds of the people within it. "We have an opportunity here," Samuel said, his voice steady, yet full of conviction. "An opportunity to create something that is lasting, something that will not just survive but thrive for generations to come. We can create a company where respect, integrity, and humility are the cornerstones of our success. A company where people are valued for who they are, not just what they can do." With those words, he turned and walked out of the room, his presence lingering like a calm after the storm. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to the executives to decide how they would move forward. Outside the boardroom, the employees who had gathered in the hallway were still in shock. They had witnessed a transformation that few could have imagined. The man they had once dismissed as old and irrelevant was now the one showing them the true meaning of leadership. James walked out of the boardroom, his shoulders heavier than before, but with a new sense of purpose. He approached the group of employees, who were still whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of everything they had just witnessed. "Listen up," James said, his voice firm but not harsh. "What we saw today was a lesson in leadership, in humility, and in respect. Samuel Walker taught us all something that none of us should ever forget, and I'm going to make sure we start living by those lessons from now on." The employees nodded, their faces showing a mix of awe and determination. They understood. They had been given a second chance, an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past and build a better future, not just for the company, but for themselves as well. In the days that followed, a palpable shift took place at Apex Technologies. The culture began to change. Employees, once focused solely on their own ambitions, now worked together with a renewed sense of purpose. Leaders, guided by Samuel's example, began to place more emphasis on collaboration, trust, and mutual respect. The company that had once been driven by ego and competition was now driven by a desire to make a difference in the lives of its people. As for Samuel, he had not returned to claim the throne of the company. He had never desired that kind of power. His return was about something far more significant, restoring the values that had been lost along the way. Samuel knew that leadership wasn't about titles or positions. It was about the impact one had on others, the legacy one left behind, and the lessons one imparted. And so, with a quiet sense of fulfillment, Samuel Walker watched as the company he had built from the ground up began to flourish once again. This time, not just as a business, but as a beacon of integrity, respect, and hope. Apex Technologies had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true success lies in lifting others up, not in standing on their shoulders. The journey of transformation had just begun. And this time, it was built on the foundation of something far greater than wealth or power. It was built on the unshakable pillars of integrity, respect, and humility. The days following Samuel Walker's dramatic return to Apex Technologies were nothing short of transformative. The ripple effect of his words and actions spread through every corner of the company, sparking a profound change in both its culture and its people. Employees who once worked in isolation now collaborated seamlessly, their relationships defined by respect and shared purpose. The management team, led by James and Richard, was slowly but steadily rebuilding the company's foundation on the pillars Samuel had so carefully outlined: integrity, humility, and empathy. Samuel's role as senior advisor was not one of high office or power. In fact, it was almost a quiet, unassuming position, a role he had chosen for himself. It was a decision born from his desire to mentor, to guide, and to continue teaching the very principles that had shaped his own success. He didn't seek the limelight. He simply wanted to ensure that Apex Technologies, the company he had once created, would flourish in ways that transcended profit margins and quarterly reports. As weeks turned into months, the changes in the company became more evident. The once cutthroat, competitive environment had been replaced by a culture of collaboration, where employees' voices were heard and their contributions truly valued. James, who had once dismissed Samuel, now sought his advice on every major decision. He had come to respect Samuel not just for his wisdom, but for his ability to see beyond the surface, to understand the deeper truths about leadership and human connection. Richard, too, had grown under Samuel's guidance. He had learned that leadership was not about managing a business. It was about nurturing a team, creating an environment where every individual could thrive. The lessons Samuel had taught him were now embedded in his own leadership style. He was no longer the ambitious, power-hungry executive he had once been. Instead, he was a leader driven by a genuine desire to serve and uplift others. But the most significant change was not in the management or even the day-to-day operations of Apex Technologies. The true transformation was in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. The company had been more than just a place to work. It had become a community, a place where people felt valued for who they were, not just what they could contribute. And it was all thanks to Samuel's insistence on the importance of integrity and respect. It was on a quiet afternoon, several months after Samuel's return, that the full impact of his influence became clear. The company had gathered for its annual celebration, a tradition that had been revived with new meaning. It was no longer just about awards or recognition. It was about celebrating the people who had contributed to the company's growth, both in personal and professional terms. The event took place in a sleek, modern hall, vast windows providing a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The guests were all present, employees, partners, and friends. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that this was not going to be just another corporate gathering. James, standing at the podium, looked out over the room of employees who were now almost unrecognizable from the people they had been when Samuel first returned. They were no longer the faceless cogs of a corporation. They were individuals, each one a vital part of a larger purpose. And as James prepared to speak, he couldn't help but think about the journey they had all been on, about how far they had come. He cleared his throat, then spoke to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today is a celebration of more than just numbers, awards, and profits. It's a celebration of who we are as a company, and more importantly, who we are as people. A company is nothing without the people who make it what it is. And I stand here today, incredibly humbled, because I know that our success is no longer defined by the bottom line, but by the strength of our relationships, our integrity, and the respect we show one another." There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the crowd. And none of this, James continued, would have been possible without one man. A man who showed us all that the true measure of success isn't in how much we take, but in how much we give. A man who reminded us that leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about lifting others up. Please join me in honoring the man who has been our guide, our mentor, and our inspiration, Mr. Samuel Walker. The room erupted into applause, and Samuel, who had been seated at the back of the hall, stood up slowly. He walked to the front with his usual quiet grace, his expression a mix of humility and appreciation. As he stood beside James, the applause continued, louder and more heartfelt than ever before. Samuel had never sought this kind of recognition. For him, the greatest reward was in seeing the company grow and flourish in ways that aligned with his values. When the applause subsided, Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but resonant. "I don't need titles or accolades," he began, his words clear and purposeful. "I never did. What I've always wanted is to see the people I've worked with succeed, not just in business, but in life. To see them grow as individuals, to become leaders who inspire others, who bring out the best in those around them. That is the true measure of success." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I stand here today not as someone who has accomplished everything, but as someone who is proud of what we have accomplished together. It is not my success that matters, but the success of this company, of each one of you. You are the heart of Apex Technologies. You are the ones who will carry this company forward." The room was silent, each person feeling the weight of his words. Samuel's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of every employee, every leader, every partner. He saw the changes in them, their growth, their sense of purpose, and he knew that this was only the beginning. "This company," Samuel continued, "will continue to evolve. We will face challenges, and we will make mistakes. But if we stay true to our values, if we remember what really matters, integrity, respect, empathy, then we will succeed. Not because we are the best in the world, but because we are the best for the world." With that, Samuel stepped back, allowing the applause to wash over him once more. But this time, it wasn't just for the man standing at the front of the room. It was for the collective effort of a company that had truly transformed. A company that had embraced a new chapter, one where success was measured not by profit, but by the positive impact they had on each other and the world. And so, as the celebration continued, it became clear that the legacy of Samuel Walker was not just in the success of Apex Technologies, it was in the people who worked there. People who had learned that true leadership, true success, lay not in what you take, but in what you give. The story of Apex Technologies and of Samuel Walker was not just about a man who had built a company. It was about a man who had changed the very meaning of success. As the final notes of the evening faded into the soft hum of conversations and clinking glasses, there was a quiet understanding in the air. Samuel Walker's presence had not only reshaped Apex Technologies, but it had also redefined what it meant to be part of something greater than oneself. The journey from a company driven by ambition and self-interest to one grounded in integrity, respect, and collaboration had been profound. But it wasn't just the transformation of Apex Technologies that mattered. It was the transformation within each individual who walked through its doors. Samuel had given them more than a vision of what a company could be. He had shown them the kind of people they could become. He had taught them that true strength lay not in power, but in humility. True leadership wasn't about commanding others. It was about empowering them, lifting them up, and helping them realize their full potential. As the night drew to a close, employees and leaders alike lingered, not in the rush of a typical workday, but in the quiet reverence of what had been accomplished and what was yet to come. The company was no longer just a place of business. It was a community, a family built on the shared values that Samuel had instilled in them. And in that room, under the glowing lights of the celebration, they understood that the journey they were on wasn't just about the success of the company. It was about the success of each person who was a part of it. Samuel Walker, standing quietly at the back of the room, looked out over the faces of his colleagues and friends. He didn't need the accolades or the recognition. He knew the most important thing was that they had learned the real measure of success. And as he looked into their eyes, he saw something that made him proud beyond words. The knowledge that they had all become something greater than the sum of their parts. It was the beginning of a new era for Apex Technologies, an era where the people mattered more than the profits, where the lessons of the past would shape the future, and where integrity and respect would guide them forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And as Samuel stepped away from the crowd, quietly exiting the hall, he knew that this was his legacy, Not the company, not the wealth or recognition, but the people whose lives he had touched and whose futures he had changed. In the end, that was the true measure of success. A success that could never be quantified in numbers, but one that would live on in the hearts of everyone who had been part of the journey. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the end of this story. Your time and attention mean a lot. We hope you enjoyed the journey and found inspiration in the transformation of both the company and the people within it. If you liked the video and the story, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting content. Your support helps us continue to share meaningful stories and create more content for you. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.